Episode 2 of ECig 101 Season 3, and this is going to be all about the basics of e-liquid. So it doesn't matter what you are actually going to be vaping on, whether you're vaping on a small pod kit or whether you're vaping on something a bit bigger like a stock coil sub-ohm tank kit, or you're going to go down the road of rebuildables later on. There's going to be one thing in common, whether you're a brand new vapor or whether you're an advanced or even hobbyist vapor that's been vaping for a while and you've stumbled on this series. You're all going to be using this. It's the one single common factor that binds all of the vaping industry and vapors together. Doesn't matter what kind of kit that you're using. Doesn't matter what your preference is, whether it's mouth to lung, whether it's direct to lung. Doesn't matter what your favourite company is when it comes to hardware, whether it's Geek Vape, Vandy Vape, Aspire, Lost Vape, whatever. There's one thing that you're going to need. And that's this stuff. It's the liquid that goes inside the tank, the pod, the dripper, whatever you're deciding to actually vape on. It needs liquid. Now, for this episode, for episode 2, we're going to be looking at the very, very basics of what actually makes an e-liquid. What actually goes in to this stuff that's being vaporised on that coil that we looked at in Season 2. Yeah, Season 2 it'll be now. What actually goes into that coil and what's actually being vaporised? Well, let's have a close-up look, shall we? Because here's the thing. Doesn't matter what company that you decide to get your e-liquid from, right? This is Dripping Desserts from the folks over at Exceptional Vapes. There we go, this is Chubby Treats, again, from the folks over at Exceptional Vapes. This is not sponsored by Exceptional, it just happens I've got a load of Exceptional stuff laying around. This is Crimson Seed from the fine folks over at the Rochford Project, and I've got tobacco vapes and all sorts of vapes kicking around here. These all have several major things in common. The ingredients that goes in to make up your liquid. For the most part, especially for these big fellas, you're going to be looking at a PG, that's propylene glycol, to VG, that's vegetable glycerin, ratio of around about 30% PG, propylene glycol, to 70% VG. So there's more vegetable glycerin by volume in this bottle compared to all other ingredients. What's vegetable glycerin? Well, it's this stuff. It is this stuff here. VG, vegetable glycerin, it's a rather thick liquid. As you can see, that little bubble in there is taking a fair amount of time to make it to the other end. It's a rather thick liquid, and it's a glycerol, vegetable glycerin. It's basically a glycerol that's been made from specific vegetables in the vegetable category. I don't quite know actually what vegetables are actually being processed to make vegetable glycerin, but you find this stuff in, well, let's see, you find it in your microwavable lasagna or practically any microwavable meal. This stuff is in it. You find it in cosmetics, you find it in lipstick, you find it in soap, you find it in shampoo, you find it in conditioner. You find this stuff in a lot of places that you don't expect, from toothpaste all the way up to microwavable lasagnas. It's in there, and it's usually in there as a kind of stabiliser, because the thing about vegetable glycerin is, for the most part, it's inert. It basically sits there and doesn't do nothing, like me on a Sunday essentially, but it sits there and doesn't really interact all that much with other ingredients that's in there with the same product that it's sitting in. So this is why it's used mostly as a kind of stabiliser. It's also a slight thickener, as you can see. But vegetable glycerin, well, if you don't know what vegetable glycerin is like when it's vaporised all by itself, fog machines. If you've ever been to a theatre, you've ever been to a nightclub, and the DJ or the managers have got a fog machine running, let's say it's for Halloween, it's usually this stuff that's in the fog machine liquid, because vegetable glycerin has got one major thing going for it that propylene glycol that we're having a look at next doesn't. This stuff creates a lot of vapour when it's a lot of vapour when it's vaporised. That's why a lot of the cloud chucking liquids, these fellas, in other words, the higher percentage VG liquids, tend to have that higher percentage of VG because this stuff makes a lot of clouds when you vaporise it. Comparing it to this stuff, which doesn't, now you can see the immediate difference. This is propylene glycol and it acts a lot like water, right? Because that's very watery in there, whereas this is taking a much longer time for the bubble to reach either end. This stuff, well, it's propylene glycol. Propylene glycol was first discovered just before the Second World War, from what I remember. It's a very old compound, propylene glycol. And like glycerin, vegetable glycerin, this is a glycol. Same kind of family as the glycerins, but a much older family, glycol. Now this stuff has been getting a bit of a bad rap recently, and it's all to do with those idiots in the anti-ECig establishment. Yes, you will find propylene glycol in antifreeze. However, what the headlines do is they stop it there. It's like, propylene glycol found in antifreeze, full stop. If they were actually decent journalists and not paid for fucking hack shells, what they would have said is this: propylene glycol found in antifreeze that's non-toxic and pet friendly. This stuff has been on the go. I'm talking serious business here, folks, because this stuff gets a bad rap, propylene glycol. PG's been around since before the Second World War, and it was found by accident mainly as a compound that was being produced to make stuff for the army, I think it was, from what I remember. But PG has got some specific properties. One of them being its freezing point. So if you get propylene glycol and you mix it with water, like a 50-50 mix with water, the freezing point of water actually lowers down considerably, comparing it to 0 degrees Celsius, which is for water itself. This is why you sometimes find this stuff in non-toxic antifreeze. Now the thing about propylene glycol is, unlike the toxic antifreeze, which you should never put anywhere near pets, kids or anything, propylene glycol's freezing point is not as low as the stuff that you get that can basically strip paint, right? The toxic antifreeze. But for the people that want non-toxic, friendly antifreeze, this stuff makes up a pretty big bulk of that non-toxic antifreeze. Also, if propylene glycol was as bad as the newspapers make out, if you were in hospital in the United States, in a lot of hospitals in the United Kingdom and some hospitals in the European Union, if you were in hospital during the 70s, 80s to the first few years of the 1990s, and you were in that hospital for anywhere longer than 3 or 4 days, you probably breathed this stuff in without even realising it, because there's 2 other properties of propylene glycol which isn't really reported on by the anti-ECig establishment. Propylene glycol does 2 major things when it's in a vaporised form. Number 1, it's a desiccant. In other words, it's a humectant. It grabs onto water and sucks it in. Humectant. It's like that little packets of silica gel that you get inside shoe boxes, the same kind of idea. It dries things out, essentially. But it does that in its vaporised form much more readily than when it's in its liquid form that you're seeing here. The second thing that PG does, it's a mild antibactericide. It's an antibacterial. Now, we're not talking the likes of Dettol here. It's nothing, no, it's not like that. But when propylene glycol is in its vaporised form, the antibactericide or antibactericide of it, with PG floating around in its vaporised form, it does 2 things. Number 1, if when the little vaporised molecule of PG is floating in the air, if that molecule of vaporised PG comes into contact with a virus or comes into contact with an airborne bacteria and it grabs onto it, If the desiccant side of it doesn't dry the virus or bacteria out, the mild antibacterial side of PG will more than likely kill that bacteria off. Now, rewinding back, when I said if you were in hospital in the United States, or some hospitals in the UK, or some hospitals in the European Union during the 70s, 80s, and the first couple of years of the 1990s, I said you probably breathe this stuff in. The reason I say that is because a lot of hospitals were vaporising gallons of propylene glycol and pumping it into their air conditioning system. Now, unlike vegetable glycerine that we looked at, propylene glycol by itself does not produce anywhere near as much vapour as vegetable glycerine does. They stopped using PG or vaporised PG in air conditioning units to disinfect it essentially in hospitals when they found much more cheaper alternatives to pump in via vaporised form during the mid-90s up until today. Because buying this stuff in bulk is rather expensive. It's nowhere near as expensive as it was in the 70s, 80s and 90s. The price of propylene glycol has came down quite a lot over the past couple of decades, but it was costing hospitals a fortune, vaporising this by gallons and gallons and pumping it into their aircon units. But hey, if this stuff was as bad as the newspapers were making it out to be, do you think US hospitals would have pumped this in vaporised form through their aircon units for their patients to breathe? No, of course they wouldn't, because the United States is so happy. Oh, I'm coughing because of the PG you're pumping in. I'm going to sue you. No, it didn't fucking happen, because this stuff's been around for so damn long that the FDA ruled it as generally recommended as safe. Generally recommended as safe. This is why the hospitals were pumping that stuff in vaporised form into their hospital aircon units. And that's the story with propylene glycol. When it comes to your e-liquid, the biggest percentage, we're talking something like 75 to the upper 80% of the contents of this bottle is going to be this, with the bulk of that, this, unless you go for a 50-50 juice if your mouth's to lunging. But if you're buying shelf-bought, store-bought stuff like this, about something like 65 to 70% of the contents of that bottle is going to be VG. So that's the story about the two major ingredients. Now we move on to the stuff that makes e-liquid tick. What we have here is a simple bottle of sweet strawberry. This is from the folks over at Chemnovatic, who also make the nicotine that I'm going to be showing you as well. But this is a simple bottle of sweet strawberry concentrated flavouring. Now, for a lot of flavours that are on the market, you're not going to be buying an e-liquid that's got one single flavour in it. You're probably buying an e-liquid that's got 2 or 3 flavours actually sitting inside that liquid. And depending on how the flavourings are layered, what the percentage of the flavouring is, it can give a very drastic effect as to how that flavour is represented once the e-liquid is vaporised. For instance, you get something like, I don't know, rhubarb and custard, right? And you pop in something like TFA, that's the Flavour Apprentice, they make flavourings. You pop in something like a TFA fresh rhubarb at 1%. So that's 1% of the entire contents of the e-liquid bottle that you're looking at, just one single percent. And then you pop in, no, not TFA's custard, TFA custards aren't all that, well, I'm not a fan of them. Capella V1 vanilla custard, and you do that at 7%. What you'll end up with when you're vaping that is you'll end up with that kind of acidic kind, you know what rhubarb tastes like, that slightly acidic hint with the rhubarb flavour, but that's going to be in the background of the flavour because you're only using 1%. The 7%, which is the vanilla custard, is going to be way up front, so you're going to be looking at a vanilla custard with a hint of rhubarb. You bring that rhubarb up just 2% and make it 3% rhubarb and keep the 7% vanilla custard. because that rhubarb's a much stronger, pungent flavour, you're going to end up with rhubarb right in your face, which a lot of people don't like, with a hint of a custard behind it. So depending on how the flavours are layered, you can have multitudes of different flavour styles of the same flavour. Like strawberry and custard, or strawberry and cream. Strawberry and cream was a really big one for vapors way back in like 2016, 2017. Some people liked it with more cream. Some people liked it with more strawberry. Some people liked it with several strawberry flavours and several cream flavours layered on top of each other. There's a multitude of things that you can do with this. But with flavourings comes a warning, a big warning. If you're going to dip your toe into, and we're going to be covering this a lot more in episodes 6 and 7 at the very end of this season, but if you're going to be dipping your toe into your own e-liquid mixing, when you're buying your flavour, make sure the flavour base, in other words, the base solution that the flavour is sitting in, is either PG based or more rarely VG based. You'll usually find that when you buy a flavouring, it's usually propylene glycol based, because unlike vegetable glycerin, propylene glycol is a much thinner liquid. It's more watery, which means it mixes a lot more easier than vegetable glycerin will. If you're buying a VG based flavour, which is very rare, they're always PG based, never buy an oil based flavouring. You usually find these on the store shelf of your local supermarket. Oil-based flavouring is made for food consumption. In other words, you're mixing it into a cake or something like that. You don't vaporise oil and inhale it. This is why when some people say, I'm going to vape my oil, it's not oil. If you were vaping oil, you'd probably die. Yeah, it's a liquid. It's not an oil, right? It's not an oil. So if you are going to jump ahead of episodes 6 and 7 of this, and you're just going to dip your toe into e-liquid mixing right now, whatever flavour you buy, make sure the base is propylene glycol, which it probably will be, or vegetable glycerin. If you're not sure, don't buy it. Simple as that. And always buy your flavourings from a reputable online seller. So that covers the flavourings. There we go. Lastly, and it's probably the most important part of any e-liquid that you're going to be vaping on, the nicotine. This is a bottle of 70, this is a bottle of 30 PG, 70 VG base, 72 milligram nic salt salicylate, and nic salt, and I can't remember what the B stands for. Hold on, it's on the label. Benzoate, there we go. Nic salt S and nic salt B. This is nicotine. And with nicotine comes a whole slew of anti-ECig establishment rhetoric. Yes, nicotine is toxic. However, did you know that nicotine is as toxic as caffeine? So you take the same high dose of caffeine and the same high dose of nicotine, they both have the same effect. You can overdose on caffeine very easily. If you're not careful, you can actually overdose on caffeine, just like you can overdose on nicotine. But you don't see the anti-ECig establishment saying, oh, caffeine's toxic and it's also an addictive substance, which caffeine is, just like nicotine. The clue's in the name, the teen part at the end. You know, but you don't see the anti-ECig establishment going, oh, we should ban coffee because people are getting hooked on the caffeine. We should ban energy drinks because kids are being hooked on the caffeine. We should ban it. No, of course they don't, because if the anti-ECig establishment was to make the link between caffeine and nicotine, and the fact that caffeine and nicotine is as toxic as each other, then their calls to ban nicotine and ban vaping outright would basically end up running into caffeine problems. Like, oh, well, if you're going to ban vaping, then you should ban coffee. Then you should ban energy drinks. In fact, you should just ban caffeine outright. Nicotine, like caffeine, has to be treated with respect, especially if you're dealing with high milligram content like this stuff here. This is a sealed bottle, so I can handle it not wearing gloves. The seal is unbroken on these bottles, so I'm fine handling it as normal. But when you're dealing with 72 milligram bottles or 100 milligram bottles in some cases, even a couple, especially the 100 milligram, even a couple of drops of that on your skin, just a couple of drops, you're going to feel that, because that nicotine will be absorbed directly into your skin and you will suffer, well, first of all, you'll get a fucking thumping headache, you'll start feeling dizzy. So yeah, when you're dealing with this, if the bottle's unsealed, in other words, you've broke the seal on it, nitrile gloves, which is going to be in the shopping list for the e-liquid mixing thing that we're going to be doing in episode 6 and episode 7. But nicotine is as toxic as caffeine. If you get 72 milligrams of pure caffeine, because this is 72 milligrams of Nic salt, which is basically pure Nic, right? That 72 milligrams of caffeine is going to have the same effect in its pure form that 72 milligrams of caffeine has. Nicotine got a bad rap. And the reason it got a bad rap is because of the late 1970s and early 1980s. The big problem with tobacco smoking has never been the nicotine. You don't get cancer from nicotine. You don't. It's been proven by the Royal College of Physicians. The reason that people are dropping dead because of smoking is because of the tar, the carbon monoxide, the 200 carcinogens in that tobacco smoke. But if you look at the list of carcinogens and you look at the list of bad things that can really, really be bad that happens with smoking tobacco smoke, and look at the cause, you're not going to see nicotine listed. The press and the media focused on the nicotine part because nicotine is addictive. Yeah, so's caffeine. And the problem for the supporters of vaping and the problem for the people that like to vape is nicotine is still getting that bad rap like fucking 4 decades on from the media pushing the anti-nicotine stuff into people's faces. Nicotine was never the problem with tobacco smoking. It was never the problem. You don't get cancer from nicotine. You get cancer from the carcinogens that are in the tobacco smoke. The ammonia. What else is in there? The ammonia, the formaldehyde, the benzoates, and all the other baseline chemical compounds from tobacco smoking that forms from burning a tobacco leaf. It's the carcinogens that give you cancer. It's not the nicotine. So this is why this stuff got a hell of a bad rap in the late 1970s and early 1980s because the media needed something to focus on. And nicotine was the big one that everyone latched onto because it covered all the negative bases that the anti-smoking press needed in the late 70s and early 80s. It's addictive. Yeah, I'll be the first to admit it. But so's caffeine. It's toxic. Yeah. I'll be the first to admit it. But so's caffeine. You don't see them running around saying, ban coffee! No, because people would laugh at them. That's why. But this stuff's been getting a bad press for a very, very long time. And there we go, folks. That essentially covers the basics of what you're going to find in your e-liquid. And I don't have anything to vape on because it's on the fucking table in front of me. But yeah, that basically covers everything to do with the basics of what you're going to find in that little 10ml bottle of TPD compliant juice that you've got from your local VPZ, or that 50ml short fill bottle of your juice that you got from your local VPZ. They might all have different labels on them. They might be made by different manufacturers. They might have different kinds of nicotine in there. More about that in episode 3, 4 and 5. We're not really going to get too deep into nicotine in this episode here. This is all about the basics of liquid, but more about nicotine as we go into the Chemnovatic episodes. But the one thing, or several things that you'll see in common with all of those e-liquids is the baseline ingredients. All e-liquids have PG and VG. There's no getting around it. Even if that e-liquid says max VG, it usually means it's 80% vegetable glycerine, but the flavouring base is still propylene glycol. So you're not going to get a 100% VG e-liquid. It's impossible. Because even if you manage to get the nicotine in vegetable glycerine base and the flavouring in vegetable glycerine base, you're still going to be looking at something like 5% of the overall volume of the bottle being the basic flavouring and the basic nicotine, which is still in the vegetable glycerine base. You will not get a 100% VGE liquid or a 100% PGE liquid, because some of that upper percentage limit has got to be reserved for the flavouring itself and the nicotine itself. But all e-liquids tend to have PG and VG in it. It's the two common factors no matter what liquid brand that you buy from. They might be using different nicotine salts, they might be using hybrid nicotine, they might be using free-base nicotine, but the two common factors is PG and VG. And now you know the story about propylene glycol. So the next time someone walks up to you and says, "You're vaping on antifreeze," don't do what I do and tell them to fuck off, which is, I get in so much fucking trouble for doing that. But don't do what I do, right? And say, fuck off. Explain to them that yes, I am vaping on propylene glycol, which is found in non-toxic antifreeze, you dumb... No, don't, just be nice. I've been at this for too long. I'm fed up being polite to the anti-ECig establishment, because most of them are fucking clowns. They are. Oh, you're vaping on antifreeze. Fuck off. Just fuck off. You're an idiot, quite frankly. You're an idiot. It's been how long? Like half a decade, probably more than that, since we've been explaining to these idiots that, yeah, PG is found in antifreeze. Non-toxic, pet-friendly antifreeze. But they suddenly go tone deaf when you mention that part, and they just hook onto the antifreeze part. They're fucking idiots. They're idiots. They are. So, you know the story about PG. You know the story about nicotine and how nicotine got a very, very bad rap in the late 70s and early 80s. Here's the thing, and I think it was either John Dunn, and I think it might have, no, in fact, was it? I can't remember now. It was either John Dunn, who's the lead of UKVIA, UKVIA is one of the big vaping trade bodies here in the United Kingdom. They do a lot of work for advocacy. Or it could have been David Dorn, who was one of the founder members of what would become the New Nicotine Alliance here in the UK. And the NNA are another advocacy group. They're a non-profit advocacy group that try and demystify nicotine. And they're finding it hard because of what happened in the 70s and 80s. It was one of those two guys that said, if nicotine was presented in a hot, milky, frothy, sweet drink, nobody would bat an eyelid. Nicotine is as toxic as caffeine. As toxic as caffeine. And nicotine has the same addictive properties that caffeine has. If nicotine was presented in a hot, milky, frothy drink, and instead caffeine was in this, what do you think would have happened? Nicotine would have been accepted, and caffeine would have been the one that was basically vilified, because, oh, smoking! It's amazing what happens when you dig deep into the subject of e-liquid, especially the subject of nicotine and the subject of propylene glycol. I hope that this video has shed a lot more light onto the subject of e-liquid, especially if you are a brand new vapor and you're filling up by squeezing that bottle for the first time and you're wondering just what the hell goes in this and what's the deal with the nicotine and what's the deal with the PG propylene glycol thing that I'm seeing on the label. Well, now you know. I'm not saying that the anti-ECig establishment lies all the time. But the problem with the anti-ECig establishment is they take a truth, they wrap it in rhetoric, and they throw it at politicians. Propylene glycol is found in antifreeze. True. True, it is found in antifreeze. But what they don't tell the politicians is non-toxic, pet-friendly antifreeze. And they generally tend to be much more environmentally friendly. The non-toxic antifreeze generally tends to be a lot more environmentally friendly than the toxic stuff. But do they say that to politicians? No, they just say, oh, people are vaping antifreeze. Politicians panic, because, that's bad. Ban flavours. Ban this, ban that. That's why the electronic cigarette industry in the United States is an absolute disaster right now. The foundations were laid by the anti-ECig establishment, pressuring groups of politicians with the whole anti-ECig rhetoric. But over here in the UK, because we've got the Royal College of Physicians, because money, massive lobbyist money, doesn't play as much a role in UK politics as it does over in the United States, we were kind of passed over when it came to the anti-ECig establishment. Sure, some groups like, who was it again, Tobacco Free Kids or something like that, over in the US, they tried to form over here in the UK. But our lobbying rules are far stricter here in the UK compared to the United States. If a lobbying group in the UK was to walk up to a politician and say, vapors are vaping antifreeze, they have got to provide documentable, scientifically backed facts to back up that statement. The same rule cannot be said over in the United States. That's why we're kind of safer. We're not completely safe, but we're safer here in the UK with all the bullshit that the anti-ECig establishment are constantly sprouting all over the place. Anyway, I think that basically wraps up. This tail end became a rant, but here's the thing, folks. If you have, what are you doing? If you've just started vaping, you're going to come across people that believe what the Daily Mail writes. You're going to come across people that believe what the Sun writes. You're going to come across people that believe what the anti-ECig establishment groups on Facebook are saying. Yes, you're vaping antifreeze. That's partly a truth. But it's non-toxic, completely non-toxic, child-friendly and pet-friendly. Also environmentally safe. Yeah. There's something else in antifreeze that you regularly drink, regularly cook with, regularly shower in. It's called water. So we're going to ban water next? See, this is how stupid the anti-ECig establishment are. You've got to watch for the pitfalls when you run into these people on Twitter, because half of them are fucking idiots, to be honest, but you've got to watch for the pitfalls when you're dealing with the anti-ECig establishment, and maybe members of your own family. Explain to them the full truth behind PG and the full extended truth behind nicotine, and it might open their eyes up. Anyway, that's it for episode 2, laying the foundation of the basics of nicotine. Now what we're going to be doing for the middle part of this season, episode 3, 4 and 5, we're going to be looking at the major nicotine distiller for Europe and possibly for the planet, because whatever e-liquid that you're buying here in the UK and over in the European Union, the odds are that nicotine was distilled by one single company, and that company is called Chemnovatic, and they're based over in Poland. And last year, and at the end of October last year, I popped over to Poland to pay Chemnovatic a visit, and that's who we're going to be looking at in the next episode.